right, friends, we are back for another round of Venus through Pisces. This is episode 4. I have already covered the function of Venus in Pisces. That was episode 1. Episode 2, I did an overview of the retrograde of Venus in Aries, going back to Pisces and then forward. So you can check that out. Episode number 3 was conjunction of Venus with Saturn in Pisces. And now we come to the conjunction of Venus with North Node Rahu. So we will go on with that and continue with the saga of this transit. There's so much more to come up. This is insane. One thing I want us to remember about this North Node discussion, again, this is not just Venus conjuncting Rahu North Node in Pisces. There's going to be a lunar eclipse where this Rahu North Node becomes a very prominent and an important topic in the sign of Pisces. And then we have a solar eclipse, but that eclipse will be at 0 degrees of Aries. We'll talk about that in another episode. I don't know how many episodes there are going to be. It's probably going to be like 22 episodes of Venus and Pisces transit of 2025, but we'll keep continuing to talk about it. Before moving on, though, please remember to like, comment, and subscribe because the algorithms need that in order for me to grow this channel, which will allow me to make this content. And if it's something of value to you, please remember to comment. And your comments are very important, at least for me, because it allows me to see how these symbols are transpiring in real time, in real lives. They tell different stories in the lives of different people. So I'd love to know your experience of it. And now let's get on to conjunction of Venus with North Node. So I'm not going to get into the nitty-gritties of what does Venus mean in Pisces because I've already talked about that extensively in the past 3 videos. I don't want to bore you if you've been watching it, and I don't want to drive myself insane. So if you guys like, you can go back to those 3 previous videos and you'll get a really good grasp for the meaning of Venus in Pisces in general. And another thing worthy of keeping in mind, I'm keep framing this narrative in terms of mostly about relationship and relational dynamics, but it's really important for you guys to look at your chart and see where is Pisces sitting in terms of what house is it sitting in. Because it's talking about the effects of this transit in that domain of life. And when we talk about relational dynamics, it's going to talk about the people that pertain to the themes of that house. For example, let's say this is happening in your 10th house because Pisces is in the 10th house. So that means you have Gemini rising, right? So when you look at the 10th house, for example, it's representing our career, public reputation, professional connections, professional life in general. So we're going to be talking about people who are related to our work life and our public life. The 10th house also represents the father. So we could have a theme happening here with the father. The 10th house also represents the mother-in-law. Maybe there's something happening with the mother-in-law. That's what I'm saying. Every house represents a domain of life, and it includes a certain type of people in that house. So when we talk about relational dynamic, it doesn't always have to be love connection and love relationship. Pay attention to that house and the kind of people that it represents and the kind of themes that it's representing. Understanding your house placement just gives you a very personalized lens about how this transit's unfolding. So that's something to keep in mind. So I'm going to put the significations. I think it goes on this side. I should learn by now. I think it's on this side. I'm going to put the significations of Rahu North Node on the side. But just to briefly go through it, so you guys get a feel for what Rahu's about. Rahu as in terms of North Node or Rahu synonymously. Interchangeably, I'll use those words, but they mean the same thing. So one of the things that the nodes in general indicate, both of them, North Node Rahu and South Node Ketu, they both indicate or signify change. And I don't mean little change, big changes. That's what eclipses are about. Huge, dramatic, unpredictable changes to a degree that it's denoting transformation. For example, Rahu amplifies, Ketu intensifies. Rahu is about amplification of external things. Ketu is about intensification of internal things. Both of them represent tremendous amount of power. I mean, if you're in doubt about the kind of power the nodes possess, Just look at the movement of the planets through a chart. All the planets are moving counterclockwise. Somehow these two guys are moving clockwise, completely going against the norm. They have that much power. I mean, the planets are moving through the secondary motion, which is that counterclockwise motion, and the nodes are moving with the primary motion. If you look at the signs, how they change hour by hour, they're also moving through the primary motion. The nodes possess tremendous amount of power. I mean, when we have an eclipse, it can indicate complete shift and change in someone's life. It's that amplified or intense. And the nodes bring about a kind of a compulsion. They radicalize things, and they can bring a lot of chaos because they can detach us from the order of our day and our time and how we proceed and our pattern, and suddenly situate us in a situation or a place in life where it's completely unknown to us. So these are some of the qualities that are important and worth remembering about the nodes, and especially since we're talking about Rahu here. And specifically about Rahu, Rahu North Node is about upward movement, forward, outwards, and it's about externalization, okay? We're not going to talk so much about Ketu right now, but those are the points worth remembering about Rahu North Node. In general, we could say that both of the nodes, North and South, Rahu and Ketu, create a lot of chaos, but we don't have to be fearful of this, because how many times have we experienced eclipses now? How many times have planets transited over South Node Ketu or North Node Rahu, and we're still here to tell the story about it? I feel that a healthier way of looking at any transit or any planetary placement is to understand what kind of lessons are they trying to impart. And this Venus coming into a conjunction with Rahu is not exempt from this. It's trying to teach us something very specific. And a lot of it has to do with how we act unreal, how our thinking is not realistic, especially because Venus just completed a conjunction with Saturn, okay? It's also talking about our power dynamics. So these are some of the themes that Rahu's trying to bring to the forefront so that we become conscious and aware of these internal programmings that we have within us. And we got to remember, at some point, Sun is going to come into conjunction with Rahu too. So this becoming conscious part is a prominent theme in this transit. Rahu is going to externalize certain facets of ourselves or the world for us to a point that we can't ignore it. It becomes so amplified and so loud that we have to pay attention and we have to see it. And that's why I'm saying that it's imparting a kind of a lesson, it's showing us something, even though it may not be pleasant. You know, before this conjunction of Venus with Rahu, Venus was in conjunction with Saturn. And Saturn was trying to show us our limits. But Rahu here is going to push us to our limits. That's what the nodes generally do. For example, taking the Venus and Pisces themes and significations in general, where there's this longing for merging, Rahu's going to amplify this so much that is going to compel us to pay attention and confront our, let's say, inner void and longing to merge with another person or with a certain situation in life, to a point that is just actually insane when you think about how much of a void is within and how much we're trying to connect, that it's lacking some rationality and logic. Rahu's going to make this so loud that we have to confront it head on. We're going to see it. There's no other choice about it. So Rahu's going to exaggerate these dysfunctional tendencies within us to such a great degree that we have to pay attention. For example, Rahu's going to show us where we're very dysfunctional in terms of how we idealize love, conceptualize love, what we think love is, what it means to be in a relationship, that we have to come to get a grip on all of this. In fact, by over-exaggerating all of these internal dysfunctions, Rahu's holding up a mirror to us, showing us, hey, buddy, you're very dysfunctional here. You lack boundaries, the way that you want to transcend what is practical and real, what Saturn just showed us. You're overlooking what it means to have a sense of self, to take care of yourself, and to actually take care of your relationship and realistically be embedded in that dynamic with another person or that kind of life circumstance that you're in. Rahu's going to show us how our notion of love is about engulfing another. It's about hunger. It's not about real love, which is selfless, which wants to give oneself to another person. It's going to expose our unhealthy power dynamics, for example. And as I said earlier, the nodes are very much about power and power dynamics. So this is going to become a big theme. And since Venus is the feminine principle, is the planet of relationships, so it's going to show these unequal power relations in our relational dynamics in general, especially when it comes to love and connection in those ways. By the end of this conjunction and by the end of this transit, which Venus is going to hit Rahu 3 times, we're going to understand our own shadow side, our lacks, our gaps, our fears, how we are over domineering, how we're fooling ourselves, how we're in a state of illusion. We have illusions, delusions about what it means to love and connect with other people. And ultimately, I was saying we can take this with a grain of salt and with a more positive perspective that this conjunction is trying to teach us something rather than trying to punish us. This is what I absolutely dislike about astrology. That doom and gloom, that, oh my God, my life is ruined. A lot of people are watching this video and many other videos because they want to know what's going to happen to them. Life is going to happen no matter what. And as it's unfolding and as it's happening, there are some positives and there are some negatives. But the whole point of it as a human being is to learn, to allow our becoming process or evolution and our growth to happen. So it's better to keep a calm mind, to keep a settled inner self, and just pay attention to what's unfolding so that we learn. And this transit is a once in a lifetime happening. I mean, the next time Venus and Saturn are going to be conjunct is in about 28 and a half years from now. And the next time that Venus is going to retrograde from Aries back to Pisces and even have this trend, I couldn't find it in the charts where Saturn would be sitting there and North Node would be sitting there. So we have come into our being into this world because we're supposed to learn this rare lesson. So it's good to keep calm and not think about doom and gloom and pay attention to what's unfolding, what's being revealed, what's being communicated to us, so that we can actually use and employ these lessons in becoming more complete as a human being. And I want to give you an example. I noticed I didn't do that in the last 3 videos. I did that a little bit with Saturn conjunct Venus, but I think putting it in the context of a certain kind of a situation that could happen, it gives us a better idea of what Rahu North Node's trying to do here. So let's say we have Rahu in Aries, right? And we have this conjunction happen in Aries. That power dynamic that Rahu wants to bring forth is going to be very overt and overwhelming. But since it's in a sign of Pisces and Venus, a receptive planet, is coming into conjunction and it's in this environment, the power dynamics are going to be covert. It can even be deceiving and disguised in a lot of ways. This kind of a placement with Rahu and Pisces is about disguise, control, and domination. It's like a sheep in wolf's clothing. I'm going to guide you. I'm guiding you. You know, you can get a lot of Messiah complex in the sign of Pisces. But when you look beneath this Messiah, this false prophet who's trying to save you from something, they're actually trying to exert their power and their dominance. This is an example of a theme that could come up in Venus in Pisces conjunct Rahu. And let me give you a more specific example. And I'm being gender specific in this video, and I was being gender specific in the conjunction of Venus with Saturn. It's because we're talking about the masculine and the feminine principle, and I just want to put that into context. And another thing worth remembering, we live in a cultural and a political climate where the word masculine and feminine have become problematized. As political concepts and as social and cultural contexts, I get it. But when we're talking about existential functions, I don't have a better word for describing the feminine and the masculine principle without bastardizing it and without distorting it. The feminine principle, all that it means is that it's a receptive, internal moving direction of existence, and the masculine is the externalizing outward movement of existence. And if you want to talk about spectrums, at every threshold of, let's say, a door, that threshold is an exit point and an entrance. And the entrance and the exit, the distance between them, is describing the whole spectrum. If you want to take this masculine and feminine principle as gender dynamics, the way that we understand it today. But I'm not going to distort these words because I personally don't have other words to encapsulate this existential function. So right now, when I'm going to say that the man in this example has a messiah complex, it could be a woman who has a messiah complex, and you can just switch the roles. So, okay, back to our story. So let's say we have a guy, a man, who has a savior complex here. And he says, I know what's best for woman. And he's positioning himself as the advocate and the protector of all women. And at the same time, when you listen to this man, he's actually restricting the woman's agency and their own sense of power. And the Rahu will do this because Rahu is trying to show us where we're dysfunctional, and it will do this by amplifying things and over-exaggerating things. For example, this male, let's say he's a public figure, and he's publicly dictating what are social norms for women, how women ought to be, for example. And dictating all these rules and laws of what it means to be a woman and how she ought to act, he has a pretext of, I'm saving them. Like, I'm saving them from moral decline. We have a few figures that are doing that, right? And at the same time, this person, this moral superior person, is completely ignoring the voice of women and their concern, for example. So Rahu here is gonna show us how this person's words, or is going to show this person to themselves, how their words is less about care and more about exerting power and control over other people. Rahu's trying to show imbalance of power between women and men, for example, in society, by using this public figure, or it's illuminating it to this public figure in their own individual life. So this Rahu figure here imposes their own subjective ideals of themselves and what it means to be a man on the entire half the population of the world on women, and what they ought to do, completely ignoring the importance of shared agency and equality. So the man here is positioning himself as the ultimate authority on what constitutes love, respect, femininity, being a woman, being a successful woman, and what they ought to value and what the value of woman in general is in our society. And what Rahu's going to do here, because this person's voice is so amplified, and it's always about externalizing it and letting it be known, and it's going to create a response and an externalized response to this Rahu figure, for example. So you're going to see a pushback against this person. If we're talking about an individual, the individual in the relationship who's imposing all these ideals on their partner, they're going to get a pushback from their partner. The partner or society is going to make them notice that these impositions are unfair, and is talking about unequal power. And this pushback, this overt, overly external imposition of the Rahu figure and the pushback that it's getting is what's going to expose the savior complex in this person, for example. And it's going to show that this person's actually making these demands, has these ideals, and is expressing them not even from their own place of strength and security. Rather, it's coming from their own powerlessness and insecurities. It's coming from a place of needing validation. So in a sense, is bringing that which is hidden, subconscious, covert, the shadow aspect of the self, right into the forefront for the individual who's making these impositions to see it, and for other people in that relational dynamic to be able to see it. In our example, this Rahu figure is projecting his own insecurities and his lack of power onto women. And he's framing his dominance as a form of guidance. So Rahu's amplification here is showing us how he actually needs to control other people. And all of this is coming from unresolved fear within this person themselves. Rahu's going to show that, hey, buddy, you're saying all this stuff. You actually have a distorted sense of self. Otherwise, why do you need to do this? Why do you need to externalize and preach the way that you do? What is this about? And it will not be unlikely that the Rahu figure will have a defense saying that they're trying to create unity, for example, when in reality, they're perpetuating dependency and control. So this transit is forcing us to see the dysfunctional aspect of relational dynamics here, especially when it comes to love and relationships. Rahu's going to show, as an example, how this person's behavior in reality is creating divisions, resentment, and chaos instead of the unity that Venus is longing for. I mean, if someone's in this kind of a relationship, even on an intimate level, not a social level, it's very hard to connect with such an individual. You don't have equal partnership. You are basically in a relationship with a predator in sheep's clothing while it's a wolf. Rahu's going to show that, hey, this sheep is not a sheep. It's a wolf. I'm going to make it super loud. I'm going to make this clear. I want you to see it. And that could pertain to ourselves. We ourselves are sometimes wolves in sheep clothing. So Rahu's amplification is going to show us this in the sign of Pisces. And Rahu is a shadow planet, right? Rahu North Node is not a real planet. It's a mathematical point. It's a point of occultation. It's the points where they eat the luminaries, the sun and the moon. That's what the eclipses are. They eclipse the most two powerful planets. That's what I'm saying. They are super powerful. So in being shadow planets and in the way that they amplified often from a psychological level, they're showing our own shadows within, how we manipulate, for example, how we want power. And the way we seek that power is through manipulation. For example, going back to our example of this individual, our hypothetical individual that we're talking about, this transit is showing us how this individual is using power to manipulate and silence other people while pretending to be the voice piece for them and holding the microphone and defending half of the population. The shadow here is, for example, an inflated ego, an unhealthy ego, or even an absence of an ego, like a narcissist. Narcissists actually don't have an ego. There's no self-concept. The ego is meant to connect the self, the internal needs, to the external world. A narcissist doesn't have this. That amplification is about fantasy making just to get validation. That's what narcissistic supply is about. Nonetheless, the narcissist is a shadow show. So Rahu's gonna, through its amplification, it's exposing the shadow side. Whether if it's just about manipulation and power control or these ways that we have within ourselves that are very unhealthy when we come to connect with other human beings. Like some shadow points of Rahu that can come out in the sign of Pisces, that whole prophet complex, savior complex, messiah complex, spiritual righteousness, spiritual superiority, self-righteousness, a lot of ego. These are the shadow points that Rahu's amplifying so that it can be seen either by the individual themselves or in their relational dynamic via other people. It becomes so obvious that the savior themselves or the people who are in a relational dynamic with this person have to confront these actions overtly and externally. It can't be brushed under the rug anymore. It's going to be very obvious with Rahu here. So in a sense, by amplifying this, Rahu's saying, I want you to dismantle this distorted narrative that you've built in your head about what the dynamic should be between a man and a woman and who a woman ought to be. So essentially, Rahu, it's exposing our insecurities here in general, our ego inflation, our ego distortions. And it's painful to confront oneself in being this way, to actually snap out of it and see what we're doing, how we're manipulating, how we're projecting our shadows onto people. And if there are other people who are experiencing this, because Rahu's augmenting and over exaggerating this, it's also painful to be in that relational dynamic and suddenly have a realization, because it's amplification and loudness, that, oh my God, I'm in a relationship with a partner who's actually trying to repress and suppress me, oppress me, rather than try to empower me. All this talk and all this nonsense throughout all these years was literally manipulation tactics. But by seeing it, then we're forced to grapple with it, wrestle with it, confront it. And by the time this transit is done, where Venus is going to hit Rahu 3 times, we're going to have application for our learning and our understanding and what we've come to realize. So I'm going to take a little break, and I actually want to ask you guys something. If you have any remedies, please let me know. When I make these recordings, I have to do a lot of editing afterwards because my throat gets dry and my voice changes and I suddenly sound like this. So if you guys have some sort of a remedy or some elixir of some sort I can use so I don't have to take these pauses, I would be very appreciative. But I'll be back in a second. Okay, I'm back. The hot water should hold me up for a little bit. Hopefully I don't have to take another break. So from here, I want us to move back just a little bit and talk about this relationship between not just Venus conjunct Rahu, but the way Venus is going to be sandwiched between Saturn and Rahu. So in the previous episode, I was discussing how Saturn is trying to show us our limitations, for example, in loving other people and connecting with them. It's trying to bring a sense of realism into relationship and our relational dynamics. But Rahu's amplifying illusions, delusions, and it's making us almost forget Saturn's lesson, what Saturn was trying to impart to us. As soon as Venus passes Saturn and starts moving towards Rahu, it's like, I forgot what were you talking about again? Which this is making it difficult for us to accept that realism that Saturn just imparted to us in terms of what we need to do to actually make our relationships work. So when Venus makes a conjunction with Rahu, we're actually going to find ourselves resisting what Saturn was trying to show us. For example, we might have an argument with our beloved, with our partner. I love that word beloved. I don't know why. It's like the lover and the beloved. It takes me back to Rumi's time. But in our relationship, let's say we have an argument with our partner. And through that argument, we have a realization, oh my God, I expect this person to do all these things, but they're actually quite unrealistic. And if I love this person, I should accept the premise of our relationship and not project all these ideal ways of being with this person, right? So we're seeing the limits and the boundaries of our relationship and the rules of conduct to actually make this relationship work. But when Venus hits Rahu, it's almost like it forgot this or it starts to resist what Saturn was trying to impart in terms of how to make things functional through setting those limits. And I would argue some of the forgetting of Venus here is because it is in the sign of Pisces. Venus in the sign of Pisces just wants to merge, wants to be one with their person. It doesn't want these limitations, separation, division, distinctions. It just wants to merge and just be as one. So when it gets the opportunity after the fight, let's say there's an apology or there's a couple of days that goes well, it's like everything that was just taught is forgotten. So it goes back to those unrealistic ways of conceptualizing relationship and what love means again when it makes a connection with Rahu. I discussed this in, I think, video number 2 when I was just setting the ground for this transit and cycle of Venus. In a sense, one of the things that Rahu is doing in this conjunction that is making with Venus after Saturn, it's showing us our fears too, how our fears can dominate rational thinking and rational knowing. For example, it can start to fear, well, if this is the realistic way of being in a relationship, and if I do this, what if I lose the person? What if the relationship won't feel satisfying? What if I'll get bored of the person? So Rahu illuminates our fears too. Illuminate, not like the sun illuminates, it just exponentially makes it so big that we feel it as something very real. And Rahu, I've said this in other videos, is like putting a magnifying glass on something. Everything just becomes disproportionately big. For example, Saturn's trying to teach us to have a healthy relationship. You need to be realistic. You're supposed to have boundaries to maintain your own integrity and the integrity of your partner. Whereas Rahu's going to distort this, and the feeling that it evokes is that boundaries and these limitations feel like vulnerability. So Rahu, relative to Saturn in this transit, is going to reveal things as fear. And Saturn is a planet of fear too. So it wasn't showing us limits in a fun way. It was doing it by inducing fear. And then we have Rahu again, and is bringing a different kind of fear. This is why this transit and this cycle of Venus through the sign of Pisces, and that second half of it, is not very pleasant. If we can learn the lesson of Saturn here about the limits that it was trying to impose, and Rahu's induced desire of wanting to merge with another person in the sign of Pisces, we'll come to very quickly understand what this entire cycle retrograde of Venus is about. Because as I've said earlier in other videos, Venus is actually going to station and go retrograde in the sign of Aries. So it's trying to show us a dichotomy or a polarity between having a sense of self and being an individual, while at the same time understanding how we can cooperate and merge with other people in a peaceful way where we can have a healthy relational dynamic. But through this transit, if we're not learning the lessons, we're constantly going to feel this lump-sided, like the teeter-totter just falls onto one side. It's all about me, or it's all about the other person, and it's all about love. We have to understand this dynamic, and these planets are one by one. All of the conjunctions and the movement of Venus in general through this entire cycle is trying to show us that. When will we learn the lesson? If we don't learn early on, if we're not paying attention, it has to hit all of these planets 3 times before we're like, all right, this is what's happening. This is the application. This is what I got to do. But we can learn this earlier too, because the amplification of Rahu is undeniable. It's hard to miss it. You've got to pay attention. What are these things? Have a moment of silence, solitude, contemplation. Pisces also represents deep knowledge. That self-reflective, deep self-knowledge can also come from Pisces and this transit of Venus. So something to engage with, not just grapple and wrestle with. We can learn a lot very early on in this transit. Now, to finish off this video, I'm just going to touch on some other themes that could come up with the conjunction of Venus and Rahu in the sign of Pisces. So we can get a lot of fears about separation and abandonment with this conjunction. For example, this conjunction might show us, hey, we really have this unrealistic and uncontrollable urge to merge with other people, or the life circumstance that we're in, that house positioning of Pisces, from underlying fears of separation and rejection, for example. We're holding on to dear life, which is the other person or that life circumstance, because there's a fear of abandonment, for example. Or we might feel subconsciously very alone. Like there's an inner void that we just cannot by ourselves negotiate with it and get along with it. So we just come under the illusion of the only way to get rid of this inner void is to be loved by another person. And there's a tremendous amount of fear of being left or not being loved. Rahu can amplify these feelings for us. And unfortunately, with these kinds of fear, if we're by ourselves and we're not in a relationship, everything feels like doom and gloom. Life has no meaning. My existence has no meaning. I cannot see the world through the eyes of the other. Therefore, I cannot have a sense of purpose in life. And then if we are in a relationship with such feelings, we might be in the most abusive and unhealthy relationship, and we cannot bring ourselves to separate and be alone and be without the person, because we fear that aloneness, being single, for example. Essentially, what the person's doing here, they're not in love. Venus in Pisces is saying pure selfless love, whereas Rahu's showing us you're using the other person to regulate your own emotions and your sense of self. There's selfishness here. This is not even love. So the fear is showing us these things when Rahu is amplifying these internal subconscious modes, ways, and feelings for us. So Rahu's showing us, buddy, you're instrumentalizing another human being to fill an inner void. This has nothing to do with love. Are we going to see that? Or are we just going to try to brush it under the rug? And there's no rug big enough to cover what Rahu is showing in its amplified way. So it's going to hurt. It's going to come to the surface. It's going to be seen. It's going to be externalized. What's even in our subconscious right in front of us for us to see it. So the lesson here is master your own internal self, your own universe and its own cosmic ocean, your internal processing, master them. You're seeing the inadequacies through the fears that are being generated. What are you going to do about them? And Saturn showed us what we got to do. We just have to remember, which we will, because all of these conjunctions are going to happen 3 times. Another thing this conjunction can show us in the name of love, how we can prioritize other people over ourselves. And again, there's a deceptive, covert thing when we do that, because we're talking about the dynamic between the lover and the beloved. So the self has to be present to love someone. If we prioritize another person's self over ourselves, are we really loving them? And let me explain. When we say I'm prioritizing my partner's need, we're generally putting it under the guise of being highly attuned to the emotion and the needs of my partner. We're claiming that we have this high degree of empathy in general as a human being to be able to recognize the other even more than ourselves. But in reality, this is saying something about identity distortion, a distortion about one's own sense of self in a lot of ways. And this retrograde between Aries and Pisces, it's one of the themes that is trying to bring to the forefront. It's kind of like what we call covert narcissism. I'm so empathetic. I'm so attuned to your needs. I know what you want. But underlying that is their manipulation tactics, because a person who does that is acting either narcissistically or they're creating codependency, or they themselves are codependents. Here, earlier, we were talking about the Messiah complex. Here we have the martyr complex, for example. And being a misguided martyr is actually about disempowering other people rather than empowering them. So if we're disempowering the beloved or partner by claiming that I'm sacrificing myself in order to save you, this is a very bad psychological tactics. And you see this a lot with a lot of parents, for example, right? I have sacrificed my whole life for you. It's a guilt trip. It's very unhealthy for a child to grow up with a parent who says that, for example. The child becomes a burden. They can't express themselves fully. Every time they come to act of their own free volition to do something, they have a sense of guilt trip about that forward propulsion in life and that forward movement. They have to retract because, oh my God, what if this creates discomfort for my parent, for example? They have sacrificed so much already. So these dynamics can come to the forefront with Rahu conjunct Venus. In a lot of ways, this kind of dynamic destroys people's autonomy. The martyr is manipulating in the background of, I'm doing so much for you. I'm so attuned to you. I have sacrificed so much for you. You'll never be with anyone better than me. That's the underlying, the pretext in this kind of a behavior and this way of thinking. And both the savior and the martyr complex has a lot of arrogance in it. And Rahu loves to amplify arrogance. After all, what does Rahu do? Rahu loves to swallow the sun, while Ketu loves to swallow the moon. What does the sun represent? Our ego, identity, sense of self, I, and its unhealthy form, arrogance. When you get Saturn and Sun and Rahu conjunct, that signature in itself can show us arrogance, for example. And Sun will be in the mix of this a little bit later in this whole transit. So this subtle form of arrogance that's coming out of this conjunction is actually a disguise again for the way we exert our control and our power on other people. And this kind of I'm sacrificing myself for you, or I'm prioritizing myself for you, is also an implicit way of telling your partner, I need you to be selfless. I need you to love unconditionally. I need you to sacrifice yourself and be devoted to me, but all through manipulation tactics. These are the things others should want to do for us from their own hearts, of their own free will and volition, not because we're manipulating them. So Rahu's conjuncting Venus in the sign of Pisces can show all of these shadow aspects of ourselves and how we operate in a relationship. In general, this is a control tactic. So, and it's a shadow aspect of the self and a shadow aspect of love and our human relation. And Rahu's amplification, again, can bring this to the forefront. It makes it oomph big that we can't ignore it anymore. Now, let's say this whole idea of I'm prioritizing you over myself is not something the person expresses externally, but they have this sense that I'm always putting other people first. This has another shadow side to it too. Let's say the person genuinely does this without using it as a guilt trip or a power trip. In this case, the person will actually lose themselves and their own preferences. This is like becoming like a chameleon. You become like your partner. Their likes are your likes. Their preferences are your preferences. Their lifestyle is your lifestyle, even though it's not suited to you. So the person's constantly reshaping themselves to meet the desires of the other person. And this could actually be a prominent theme in Venus and Pisces before it gets a sense of maturity in life, because it sees it as something like ego dissolution. Instead of seeing that healthy connection of self with the other, it should create a sense of wholeness and fullness. The person here generally tends to adopt another person and their ways of being to have a sense of self. Or in the process of doing it so much, they lose their sense of self. And in a sense, this is kind of like engulfing other people. You know, it's to a certain point, it is a point of flattery when someone else is doing things like the way you do it. They adopt your preferences. But when it's in an intimate relational dynamic, at some point, the person as the object of this person's desire, the person who doesn't have preferences, they're eating the other person away too. It's crazy. It's like even that person who's being emulated and worshipped, they're being consumed over time because the other person doesn't have their own. They're not bringing anything to the table. They're not contributing anything. So it's like because a person lacks their own identity and their own sense of self and they cling on to this person, this other person, even if they had a strong sense of self-identity, they start to lose it over time. They become weaker as a human being too. You don't want someone to plagiarize your life, your hobbies, your vocation, your lifestyle. You want to be with someone who has a strong sense of themselves and they have their own thing, and is the combination of these two parts that come together that gives rise to a third variation, which is something that Venus in Pisces wants to do. You want 1 + 1 to actually equal 3 when you have Venus in Pisces. Something bigger than the parts that went in should emerge out of it. But if you have 0 × 1, that'll equal 0. Nothing will come out of it. So this whole not having a strong sense of self-identity and how we're engulfing and eating away at other people by plagiarizing and by taking their ways of being can be illuminated. We might see, hey, my partner's doing this, not cool. Or we might see that we're doing this. And the saving grace here is that Venus is going to dip into Aries. The entire retrograde starts there, and Venus is going to have to end its cycle there. So hopefully we can come to have a better grip on who we are and allowing other people to be who they are. We want to be self-possessed and command of ourselves. That is a healthy sense of self. That's the way to feel authentic. You don't want to feel like someone's plagiarizing. your sense of authenticity because you become inauthentic in that relationship. So yeah, Rahu can illuminate that. And the next point, something else that Rahu can illuminate, magnify for us is the need for external validation, because Rahu North Node is all about externalization. So Rahu's always looking outside of itself. It forces us to look outside of ourselves for a sense of identity, who we are, what we ought to do, how we ought to be. So it forces us to rely heavily on external validation. And this process also contributes to erosion of our self-identity. It's worth remembering that because it makes us highly dependent on other people's approval, such as our partner, to feel worthy, valuable, and something good. And the way Rahu will do this and show it to us is by actually amplifying our insecurities, by creating a feeling of incompleteness or being alone. And it's this insecurity that constantly forces us to look outwards, believing that our sense of self-worth can only be mirrored back to us through the gaze of another. So we have a sense of personal validation and our existence is validated if our desirability is given to us by our partner or by the external circumstances that we're in. And this feeling of validation could simply be about wanting to be loved, but it's also showing us how we disapprove of ourselves, how we are incomplete. So this amplification of Rahu is a great life lesson if we're seeking for that validation externally. And then another problem is this can also contribute to that sense of losing one's identity and sense of self again. We become dependent on the other's gaze, on our partner's gaze. And that dependency will force us to do whatever it takes so that we get that validation. And I was saying that when Venus conjuncts Rahu, it kind of forgets what Saturn had taught it, is because if we do anything at any cost for the validation of our partner, for example, we're going to find that we're compromising our boundaries, that we're overstepping the reality of what qualifies a relationship or a dynamic as something that's healthy. So this is another point that we might have to work on, something that Rahu's going to bring to the forefront. And one more thing about this constantly trying to get external validation. This external validation will lead to erosion of self-identity, because we constantly need someone else to tell us that our existence matter, that we're good, that we're okay. So when we don't get it, it creates a void. When it turns into 2 days, the void gets bigger. And there are times where couples will go through a patch of conflict that could last for months. So what then? You just have this big hole, an inner void within you because you're not getting the validation from another person. This could happen in a work environment. Again, going back to the 10th house, the boss has not told you that you've been doing a good job. So you need that validation to have a sense of drive. And it's been months and months, and you just feel this inner void. You're losing yourself almost. You're losing the purpose of why you're there, even though you love what you're doing. So in a sense, it's making us disconnect from our own inner being, this need for external validation. And it just creates a perpetual feeling of not being satisfied in life. In a sense, we're becoming addicted to some sort of a feedback loop that's constantly seeking the approval of other people, just to have a momentary affirmation of the fact that we exist and matter. And of course, general, the swallower of the sun, the self, can in general distort our sense of self, our self-worth. And because it's an externalizing planet, and in this case is involving Venus, which is a relationship and a relational planet, it makes our self-worth contingent on some sort of an approval from the external world, and making us forget that true sense of self-worth comes from within and not externally. So in this way, Rahu keeps us in a perpetual state of seeking for more, for something out there, the illusion, the mirage of being fulfilled by something out there rather than finding it within. And all of these dynamics that Rahu brings to the forefront actually diminishes intimacy, that connection that Venus is so deeply wanting to have, that sense of completion that Venus is trying to bring. In a relational dynamic, Rahu is distorting it to the nth degree. So in summary, we could say that Rahu's role here as a teacher, Professor Rahu here, is bringing to the forefront our deepest desires, our fears, and especially dysfunctional patterns in relationship, because it's showing us our shadow points in life and how we're trying to connect with other people. It's showing us our subconscious motivations that are unhealthy, patterns that doesn't actually allow love to be love or to be sustainable. So it's amplifications teaching us what our delusions are, where we're dysfunctional, and perpetually self-sabotage and sabotage love, connection, relationship, unity, cooperation, peacefulness, harmony. These are the things that Venus does. You know, sometimes we get into certain kind of a conflict or an argument with a partner, and we don't even understand the depth of it, where it's coming from. Even middle of the fight, there's a question mark in the brain, like, why am I doing this? Or why is this person doing this? These are the kinds of dynamics Rahu is going to bring forward. And that's how it's going to amplify it. See what I mean? The voice is going again, but we're getting to the end, so I'm not going to take a break. So Rahu's going to amplify it and show it in that way. But in those moments, if we find ourselves in such situations, we should take a moment. If we need to have the fight, but afterwards find a quiet space and try to think about, what was that from? Like, I started this whole argument. I'm not sure what my argument was, but I needed to assert something, and I felt like I didn't have a good sense of self in that moment. Look, I was manipulating? What was I doing? It's good to figure these out, because it's just going to bring it out in these shadowy, distorted kind of ways. But these are the precursors to us to understand what kind of patterns we hold subconsciously, what those missing links within us are, and how we're trying to go out in the world, externalize ourselves to fill these inner voids, gaps, lacks, missing points within. So we have to pay attention. So in the first point of contact with Venus, so Venus conjunct Rahu, the first time Venus is in its direct motion, doing its thing, when it makes a connection with Rahu, it's a point of revelation and understanding. It's bringing awareness to the forefront by amplifying things. It's forcing us to confront our patterns so that we have a realization through this amplification process. This first conjunction is allowing us to have a glimpse of our fears, illusions, subconscious patterns that are very self-sabotaging and sabotaging our relationships. It's showing us our hidden motivations, because it's externalizing them, it's amplifying them. The second time when Venus hits Rahu in its retrograde motion, so it's going back from Aries to Pisces, it encounters Rahu again. This is a process of internalization. So it's actually a time where we should become more introspective and start engaging with process of integration. We actually have psychological insight this time around, because we've seen it. We saw it act itself out in the world with our partners in those life circumstances where Pisces representing the house that is sitting in. So it's time to start shifting the way that we try to connect with other people. And then the last time that Venus is going to make contact with Rahu, it's in its direct motion, so it finishes retrograde period. Now it's just aiming to make its way back out to its own home, which is a sign of Taurus eventually. We should start to have embodied wisdom now. That means we know how to act based on what we have learned. So now it has to become part of our lived experience and expressions. So we're consciously embodying the knowledge that we've gained through this transit. And in this way, very proactively, we can start to engage with our relationship with tremendous amount of awareness and understand how we bring these unhealthy part of ourselves into relationship, or see the partner and to see how it's happening to us, so that we can set limits and boundaries, so that we can eventually merge a little bit more, till we have a stronger connection. That's what couples therapy is for, right? Confront your shadows, integrate your shadows, understand your partner and their shadow, work through it till you eventually have something very solid and stable, the profound dynamic that you want to have in loving someone and connecting with someone. So again, these transits are teaching us something. We shouldn't see them just as doom and gloom. And I believe I'm going to leave off the talk here for today. I'll be back, and I'm guessing we're either going to talk about conjunction of Venus with Neptune, or we're going to talk about the ingress of Venus into Aries. Stay tuned, and I'll talk to you guys soon. Much love. Till next time.